Welcome to this late episode of Silicon Wafers, and this is to cover a breaking story, one which I think deserves a lot more detail and, of course, more coverage over the coming days. It is truly another disturbing story that involves Donald Trump. Trump is trying to stop Europe's 140 billion euro lifeline to Ukraine. Europe thinks it's found a legal financial hack to turn Russia's frozen billions into 140 billion euro interest-free reparations loan for Ukraine. And just as leaders line up to back it, reports say that the Trump White House is balking, raising market stability, fears, and casting doubt on G7 unity. What's the plan? What's the pushback? And can Washington block Brussels? And of course, the big question is why Trump would do this when this plan would have a significant impact on Ukraine's resilience, potentially even turning the tide of the war. So here's the plan, plain and simple, the elevator pitch, if you like. The EU doesn't confiscate Russia's immobilized central bank assets. Instead, it uses the cash stuck at Euroclear in Belgium as Russian securities matured to buy zero coupon commissioned bonds, and on that basis extend a 140 billion euro 0% loan to Ukraine, payable only when Russia pays reparations. It's ingenious and gets around many of the concerns that timid lawyer types had about simply handing that money over to Ukraine. A senior EU official framed the core legal line this way: what we are proposing is not confiscation. That's reported in The Guardian, October 20th, 2025. Belgium still wants rock-solid guarantees that it won't stand alone if lawsuits hit Euroclear. Leaders are set to task the Commission on October 23rd, 24th to draft the law. The goal is to close the legislative process by year end. Brussels is also exploring a workaround to prevent a single state veto from unexpectedly unfreezing the assets by shifting some sanction rollovers to qualified majority voting. Of course, they have Hungary and Slovakia in mind, who have happily been shilling for the Kremlin throughout the war. Well, why 140 billion euros and not 185, which is the full amount that is held by Euroclear? Roughly 185 billion euros of Russia's sovereign cash is trapped at Euroclear, but around 45 billion euros is already earmarked to service the earlier G7 $50 billion ERA loan to Ukraine. That leaves 140 billion to lend. And that is from a Reuters explainer put out on October 6th. Well, what can Ukraine buy with the funds? A commission paper suggests that most of the funds could be deployed to build Ukraine's and Europe's defense industry, especially joint projects. But a slice can be used to buy weapons outside the EU, i.e., from the US, if needed. This ought to be attractive in theory to Trump, and that's probably why that clause has been put into the law, as it would provide a major boost to US industry and jobs. But little Donny isn't happy, apparently, or rather, some of his friends aren't. Here is the pushback from Moscow. The Kremlin calls it theft, full stop. Dmitry Peskov: we are talking about plans for the illegal seizure of Russian property in Russia. We call that simply theft, reported on 1st of October by Reuters. And of course, Russia would know all about theft. That is the very foundation of its statecraft and culture. Russia will threaten countersuits, economic retaliation threats, and a pressure campaign on Belgium and Euroclear. But what capacity do they have to threaten while they are under sanctions? I would guess very little. Well, that's from Reuters. And here's the twist in Washington. Multiple outlets, citing people that have been briefed, report that the US won't join the EU-led expansion of frozen asset use for now, flagging risks to market stability. Well, the timing is important. Their objections come right after Trump's high-profile Putin call and outreach by the dictator, and before the EU leaders' summit. That's from Bloomberg. The timing is convenient for Putin. and I think hardly coincidental. Well, two things can be true at once. One, the US isn't needed financially to do an EU only loan. The bulk of assets are in Europe, and the Commission doesn't need US guarantees to issue its own bonds. Again, Reuters. But point two, US political cover still matters for markets, G7 signaling, and to limit legal risk perceptions. Euroclear is globally embedded. The ECB and Belgium care about spillovers, reputational damage. That's in Reuters. So EU objections are both divisive and worrying, even more so as there is no real market risk to the US, and the scheme does not encompass any funds held by the US. Their objections, therefore, are odd in the extreme. On the record, Valdis Dombrovskis says the EU will seek to exclude the guarantees from deficit metrics and stresses that, with assets held until reparations are paid by Russia, guarantees shouldn't have to be called. This is an attempt to calm the fiscal hawks and the markets. It should be sufficient. That's from Reuters, October 10th. Meanwhile, Europe's politics are shifting. Poland's Radoslaw Sikorski is blunt. It's very simple, he says. Either we use the aggressor's money or we will have to use our own money. That's from The Guardian, October 20th. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz has swung in behind the loan, and that is a big change in tone and substance from Berlin. That's according to The Guardian. But can Trump actually block the loan? Well, the short answer is not directly. It's an EU instrument built on EU-held assets and with EU guarantees. But a US refusal can complicate and discourage. Here are four levers to watch. One of them is G7 cohesion. The EU wants other G7 partners to mirror its mechanism. US refusal blunts the optics and can make Belgium and some centrists a bit more skittish. That's according to Reuters. Then there is market signalling. If the Treasury pointedly refuses to play, investors may price in legal and political tail risk around Euroclear and Commission issuance. This is exactly the market instability concern that US officials have voiced privately, says Ukrinform. This suggests that the risk the US is complaining about is the very risk that will be manufactured by the US issuing those doubts itself. The concerns and volatility encouraged by the very stance the US is taking. The irony is horrific. The US constantly berates Europe for not stepping up and covering the costs of its defense and that of Ukraine and the war, and then it blocks or seeks to sabotage the boldest and most courageous move the EU has taken in that direction. Is anyone else seeing the problem here? Not only the US being an obstruction to a just peace, but also a blocker to Ukraine defending itself and a grotesque hypocrite into the bargain. Then there are policy trade-offs. The EU's draft explicitly allows spending outside the EU. For instance, read the subtext, that is to buy US kit, to keep Washington engaged. If the White House still says no to that incentive, the loop weakens. Again, let's state this plainly, that Trump's position here weakens not only Ukraine and the EU, but also betrays advantages to the US economy and US companies. It is, in a word, madness. Then there are IMF dynamics. Fresh IMF programming for 26 to 27 matters. US support at the fund is pivotal, even if the reparations loan is EU owned. Hedging from Washington raises questions on macro assurances and sequencing, according to Reuters, but the IMF has started swinging behind the plan in the last few days, and it has been changing a long-held stance that the money should not be used in this way. So the US may well find itself at variance with IMF expert opinion in the coming days on this matter. Well, the bottom line here is that Trump can't veto the EU, but he can raise the cost of courage and embolden holdouts. As Carnegie notes, the scheme's political inevitability is colliding with Belgium's liability fears and the ECB's caution, and now it is colliding with a US attempt at sabotage. Here is the battlefield and the politics behind why this is so important and why the funds need to be released for Ukraine. Why the urgency? Well, Ukraine's 2026 to 2027 financial hole is 60 billion euros, and it's likely to carry on at that level for several more years. The IMF estimate cited by the European Commission, European leaders see an April 26 cliff for Ukraine's warfighting budget if these stopgaps run dry. That's why they're moving now to front load the fight and make Moscow believe that Western support rises, not falls over time. And this funding that is set against Russian assets is absolutely critical to lock in, to fill those financial holes over the next 3 years for Ukraine. Otherwise, Europe is going to have to stump up those costs. Europe's pitch to skeptical capitals, this isn't expropriation, it's bridging finance until reparations are paid, or in Sikorsky's distilled version, use the aggressor's money before asking of their own taxpayers and risking their goodwill. That's from The Guardian. So what happens this week? Well, here's the near-term choreography. EUCO, October 23rd to 24th, leaders greenlight the legal drafting and haggle over risk-sharing wording to satisfy Belgium. Keep an opening for willing G7 partners as well. That's from Radio Free Europe. Then there is the Commission draft. This clarifies the no confiscation structure, a QMV-style sanctions rollover, and the spending split between EU defence production and external procurement. Then there is the US posture, for now non-committal. Bloomberg says officials privately cited risks to market stability at IMF week meetings that may shift or harden once the EU puts black letter law on the table. That's according to Bloomberg. One more strategic wrinkle. The EU even floated buying US weapons with part of the loan, both to get Ukraine what it needs quickly and to keep Washington invested. Will that sweetener matter if the White House is focused on transactional ceasefire first diplomacy? That's according to the Financial Times, and that is the most optimistic way of framing this question. I would say if another call with Putin fires Trump up to oppose the scheme yet more vociferously, that is a greater danger. And if he does, Trump will be fighting in direct opposition to Ukraine, to Ukraine's interests, in opposition to the EU and the interests of his own electorate and taxpayers. Only Russia will benefit from this sabotage attempt. So should Europe press ahead without the US? Well, my take is yes, of course, but with their eyes open. The legal design, no seizure, replace with EU bonds, collective guarantees, exists to Trump-proof support and to calm the ECB. Markets can digest risk if politics and politicians are firm. If the EU hesitates now and doesn't show leadership, it will embolden Moscow and benefit Putin. As Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty reports, leaders look set to instruct the Commission to leverage 176 billion euros of Euroclear cash for a loan covering most of Kyiv's next 3 years of needs. And as I say, 50 billion already provided, 140 would be the new tranche. This is a one-off, temporary, and it is tied to eventual reparations payments by Russia. But if Trump continues to block, be assured that there are very slim legal and financial grounds to oppose this deal. If the deal fails because of Trump's stance, then Ukraine's survival and victory will be burdened with greater uncertainty. European defence and security will be significantly weakened. EU taxpayers will be massively disadvantaged, and the US will lose out on huge investment opportunities and a windfall of jobs and contracts. Only Vladimir Putin and his illegal war will benefit. Bear that in mind if Trump continues to oppose the scheme. Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kyiv of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kyiv of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course, much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kyiv of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work. The very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend, operator Starsky, says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times, and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kyiv's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Jolyon Ellis, filmmaker on Kyiv of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. A final word from our partners, the makers of Kyiv of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.